I'm going to this will be informal. I'm going to introduce Sarah, though you can find her bio online. Many of you have already read it, but I have my own, how shall I say, custom-made introduction of her. I met Sarah for the first time in Abu Dhabi at the NYU campus there, where she was visiting her parents, both of whom were working with the university for a given period of time, and we forged a friendship basically from that moment on because of our, how should I say, joint interests in film. But I'm going to read a little bit of the formal bio, and then I'll vary from it. Sarah also studied modern culture and media, which she graduated with from Brown, and then went on to, has been dancing and making films for many, many years. Her work as a filmmaker and choreographer has brought her to the intersection of moving images and moving bodies, which is what we're going to hear her talk about today. Her films have screened in festivals including the New Directors' New Films, New Orleans Film Festival, Cucaloras, Anthology Film Archives, and at dozens of screen dance festivals internationally. Her choreography has been presented in many dance spaces across NYC, including Dixon Space and at the Martha Graham Studio and the Brooklyn Arts Exchange. She's she's received a number of grants and fellowship, you can imagine. Anyway, that's all data. What I really want to say about her, which I hope you will all take to heart, and I can see that you're positioned to do so given your interest, and I'm going to talk about you in the third person, but one of the things I appreciate so much about Sarah is the way in which her work constantly intersects a certain quality, really high quality of research with her imagination, her love of cinema, and her facility with those techniques, as well as dance. So it's a kind of convergence. And every project she does seems to be a different cross-section. So it's a kind of urban landscape of her mind, and she is plotting the map through the course of it, and it's really, from the outside and as your collaborator, colleague, friend, really beautiful to watch. But one of the things I also want to emphasize is that there has been a divide in recent years between scholarship and art. And the two are not, how shall we say, arbitrarily divided, or even, thinking belongs to every artist. And one of the things that's really beautiful about Sarah's work is the thinking in the work, which you'll witness tonight. So I hand it off to you.
Thank you, Gail. I love this woman, and so if she asked me to come and give a talk in a shopping mall or a gas station, I think I would just as gladly go. And it's wonderful that it gets to be here with all of you in Florence. And thank you for those very kind words.
Oh, it's delightful.
So what I want to do today is, as Gail mentioned, I'm interested in this intersection of moving images and moving bodies. In particular, looking at habits as choreography and routines, and just in general, the conditions of contemporary bodies and how they can be represented on screen. And so filmmaking for me is very much a choreographic practice, and choreography a filmic practice. And that's sort of a very neat, nice way of wrapping up what I do with a bow. And so what I want to do is actually talk you through my two last projects and how that really functions practically, working with dancers, working with the crew, and the research process that has gone into these two projects. So the first project I want to share with you is called Home Exercises. And actually this is a still from that film. It is a hybrid documentary and a dance film that looks at aging bodies and how elderly individuals in their homes, how their habits and routines are dance and choreography. And then we'll talk about Crowds, which is the project that's brought me here to Italy. I'm living in Bologna right now. I've been in residence with a dance group there, and we just wrapped production last week on this new dance film installation. So I'll give you are going to be the first guinea pigs. We literally just wrapped shooting and nobody has seen anything, so I'll show you just one shot from that film, and we'll talk through it a bit. So before I talk at you anymore, I'm just going to show you home exercises, and we'll go from there.
relax. Okay, keep the body loose. Relax your head, your body, your arm, and your leg. And close your eyes. And think of nothing. And breathe in and out. And just think of nothing. Do about 3 or 4 minutes, and no difference. So keep breathing in and out. Your head start hanging on the ceiling, loose. Keep your neck loose, your shoulders loose, your arm, your body, your waist. Your leg, your knees, your toes. Keep relaxing. Breathe in and out slowly. For a few minutes, you should be able to feel relaxed. Feel better.
Normally, I wouldn't make people sit through a credit sequence, but I love George, who's one of our cast members' meditative direction. So I don't want to deprive anyone of his instructions. So for this film, there were mainly 2 research processes that I went through to make it. The first was I got really obsessed with workout videos and the history of exercise on screen and started tracing the workout video from early films up until what we think of the workout video of the present. And some of the first videos that really fascinated me were Boy Scout training videos. This is a still from one of them from the 20s. And when we get the birth of the motion picture camera, and it coincides with the rise of exercise culture. And so as soon as we start seeing moving bodies on screen and exercise on screen, it's taken up for political purposes. So from this Boy Scout video that was created in the United States to the use of exercises in Nazi youth films, so many of the earliest examples of what I would consider a workout video are nationalist, involve this element of nationalist politics and of linking repetitive movement for nationalism. This is going to be a very, very fast history of the home workout video. You jump ahead and we start seeing workout videos that look a lot closer to what we would think of the form today, where there's this centered shot, there's an individual in a living room, they're facing the camera, they have a vocal address to the camera inviting you to move along with them as if you are in the room. So the videos of Jack LaLanne, who's considered the godfather, or the grandfather, I guess now, of exercise videos, Debbie Drake, all of these videos were really important for me in figuring out how we were going to shoot home exercises. And what astounds me is that, this is still from her TV show in the 1960s, is that the form really hasn't shifted that much. The formal characteristics of the workout video today share a lot in common with these TV shows, and I think that's really amazing. There's such a migration of forms, and that this one has remained really really true to its origins, and it has not shifted. This move into the living room that we get around the 50s, I think it's not just a matter of backdrop. What's fascinating to me about these videos being in living rooms is that they invite the viewer to dance along with their home environment. And that normally we think of domestic spaces as places of repose, of rest, but instead these videos really prompt motion, that you're supposed to be moving along with your home. You're supposed to use the objects and the surfaces in your home as a dancing partner. So a lot of these videos would have people doing, counterbalancing against their couch. You use a soup can as a weight. You shimmy up against your carpet. There's all of these exchanges between your body and your home space. In that way, way, they also create these habits. There are these choreography creating, habit forming videos. And that's where I started the other research process for this film, which is working with elderly individuals. At the time that I was developing this, my day job was as an elderly companion. And one of the inspirations for this was the main client I had would wall walk. What wall walking is if you have vertigo or a balance issue of some kind, you figure out, instead of using an assistive device like a cane or a walker, you figure out basically where in your home you can hold on to something or you can touch something. And so the woman that I was working with, she had figured out in her Manhattan apartment exactly how far she had to be from a given surface or object. And so it was everything from knowing how far her arm was from all of her walls to where her hips were in comparison to any object or surface in her home. And she did this to avoid injury, to avoid pain, but what struck me about it was that there was a very choreographic logic to this way of moving, that she had patterned her day, she had patterned her habits in a way that was thinking like a choreographer of creating locomotion in a very distinct way. And so when I started developing this film, the collaborator I worked with, Rachel Balaban, who produced this, she teaches dance for Parkinson's and dance for aging individuals. And we started interviewing all of her students and asking them about their daily routines, and so many of them shared this choreographic logic. One woman always kept her oven open so that she had something to hold on to, because otherwise there was not enough space. There was too much space between her body and the walls. There was another woman who, as you saw in the end, used to be a ballroom dancer, and she found that movement in sponging her counters down every night. And it was a huge challenge getting these individuals to think of their habits as dance, but so many of them really used this choreographic logic in getting through their days. And so that's how we created the choreography for this film. So moving on to the project that I'm working on now in Bologna, Crowds, I similarly started off with more of an archival research process. I started looking at YouTube videos of crowd formations across so many different types of crowds and eras, everything from funerals, mosh pits, parades, protests. And when I would watch these videos, I would look specifically for thresholds. That is, if we have a typology of crowds of saying this is what a mosh pit is versus this is what a protest versus a riot, a congregation versus a parade, I was looking for the thresholds of these crowds in their choreography. So what are the formations that distinguish one crowd from another, the gestures, the rhythmic patterns of the bodies, the directions that they move in, and when does one become another? And it's at those thresholds that I really based the choreography of this project. And so I've been working with this group of 25 dancers, and we created this hour-long dance where they're one crowd, but they constantly transform into another, much like murmurating birds. I don't know if you guys have seen murmurating birds. It's a swarming pattern that's not hierarchical. You basically see this swarm that it folds in on itself constantly, and you don't get this clear path of communication from the top down. Instead, it's as if there's this internal knowledge that kind of there's upheaval and this constant mutation. And so the idea was to get this crowd to transform in that way if we could figure out where these thresholds were. And then the other, I guess the other archive that we used to create the choreography was that of the dancers' bodies. There are 25 of them. They come from 13 different countries. And when we started rehearsing together, I asked them to tell me their crowd experiences, their memories that were most powerful to them. So we had a young woman who had been a part of a rugby team that restaged a scrum. There was a guy from Mexico who loved going to ska concerts and showed us all how to mosh as they do in ska concerts in Mexico. An activist from Poland who showed us the gestures that they use in Poland. And then we started incorporating this into the crowd movements that I had become interested in, and it kind of unraveled from there. And once we brought all of those different types of crowd movement into the dance studio, we started using improvisation and created this improv exercise that we tentatively called crowding, where we would start by articulating verbally the logic that we had observed in these different crowd patterns, and then they would just go for 30, 40 minutes as this crowd that was constantly transforming. And then we would take little bits of movement that we liked and add it into the choreography. And then the other main research process wasn't with the dancers so much, but with the camera crew that I was working with. In crowds, we made it for installation. It has 4 channels, and each channel emulates a viewpoint that is typical of how we've imagined crowds in the 20th century in still images and video. So the first channel is shot from above. It's not exactly a bird's eye view. We shot it from a crane. It's as if someone is watching from a neighboring building. The second is all dolly shots that surround the piazza, as if someone is on the periphery observing this crowd but not quite ready to join it. The third is all panning movements of a very telephoto lens of finding one face at a time, losing it, finding another. And the final one is all Steadicam footage inside the crowd. And these viewpoints are very stereotypical of how we envision crowds, from the YouTube videos I was watching to newsreel footage of demonstrations. These are fairly typical of how crowds are imagined on camera. And so in each channel, there's this distinct relationship between the body of the camera and the body of the crowd that's largely negotiated through distance. In screen dance studies, there's kind of become this trope of the dancing camera. And for me, what was more significant to think about and talk about with our crew was not of animating the metal apparatus of the camera, but rather of thinking of the camera operator as being this embodied agent that was a part of the choreography. And so I want to show you an excerpt from this and talk about practically what it meant to talk to our crew and ask them to be a part of this choreography. So I'm going to show you an excerpt from the second channel of this. And you are the first to see this. It's not been mixed for sound. We wrapped last week. But we'll look at this and then we'll chat. create this shot, we used a trackless dolly. For those of you who aren't film nerds like myself, a dolly is basically it's a device you put on a kind of like train tracks, and it moves very slowly. Because the space was huge, we couldn't afford to actually get a dolly with tracks, and so we were using one that just had rolly wheels. And so our grip, Giorgio, who was the one responsible for pulling off this shot, what I asked him to do was essentially to move the slowest he felt his body could move ever or had ever moved. And so he's pulling this cart and walking backwards, and I did not direct his body of how to pull this off, and how he did it was much like a dancer would move through fourth position, which is a ballet position where your feet are like this. And so watching him was incredible because he was moving slower than anything. If you watched him too long, you could no longer see that he was moving unless you watched his feet, which were shifting backwards in this kind of overlapping pattern. And we asked him, in the end, what he sort of did was emulated this movement of the one woman who's this outsider who you saw cross around the others. And so for me, this was the perfect embodiment of this idea of an embodied camera operator, and that it had no one was watching the camera move. We were watching our operator's body move very, very, very slowly in response to the dancers who were moving at this very rapid pace. In contrast to Giorgio, who did this dolly shot, our final channel, which is all Steadicam movement, our Steadicam operator, again, I'll pause for those of you who don't know what a Steadicam is. It's basically a rig that attaches the camera to the body of the operator so that they can move and the camera doesn't absorb all of the movement of their movement, if you will. So instead of the camera looking handheld where you get all of the shakes and you see that the camera is indeed held, it absorbs it all. It feels much more weighted. It feels like a body does in relationship to gravity. So you can get these, you can get movement that feels more like a human than a shaky object. And so I wanted our operator to be a part of the crowd, and yet I didn't want him to have any more access than our dancers did to the rest of the space. So he wasn't weaving through them, but instead had to follow the same rules of the choreography that they were. He, however, did not know the choreography going into this. So what I asked him to do was to follow one person at a time, but that he could constantly be responsive to how his body felt in the crowd. So as you could see in this example, this still, he was behind the dancers, but if they edged up a little bit and he was feeling the claustrophobia of that given formation, he did not have to edge up with them. He could pause. He could back up. He had to remain a part of the crowd, but still kept this physical agency within it. And I would be sort of right behind him, whispering little things in his ear of what was going to happen because he had to be looking in the camera. He couldn't have the peripheral vision that the dancers did. And so in terms of this idea of them being a part of the choreography, it wasn't just theoretical, it also had to do with how we actually managed people on set. So in the case of Giorgio, our grip, after we finished this you only saw 10 minutes of it, it's actually a 40-minute long Steadicam take, which is, if you're not a film nerd like me, that is a feat for a grip to pull off. We brought him out into the piazza, told the dancers what he had done, and they gave him a standing ovation, and he bowed for them rather than the opposite. And then with Andrea, our Steadicam operator, we split the dance into these 10-minute sections, and before each one, I would introduce him to whichever dancer he would be following and responding to, and it was a very quick introduction, and it reminded me a little bit of how one meets a new dance partner in a social dance setting, and let's say it's a do-si-do or a square dance, and you meet the person that you're then going to immediately start moving with. So this idea of our crew being a part of the choreography was very much a social thing as well. And so in contrast to home exercises where our operators were constantly still, I think both were equally, the crew was a part of the choreography in equal measure. It just in the first, stillness and patience had to be choreographed just as deliberately as the animation of this one did. So these two projects for me were different ways of going about my method of working, which is of using cinematography to make sense of choreography and choreography to make sense of cinematography. And for me, it's that intersection that I am curious about and keep working in, and how I operate. So, thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions.
I have a couple of, I'm going to just start the questioning, if you don't mind. Megan, how much time do we have till 7:15? Okay, perfect. Okay, great. I love this work, but anyway, let's start with home exercises, and I'm curious to know, as you were making it, particularly as you were bringing shape to it, and by shape I mean determining the length of the scenes and identifying in what sequence they would flow. Well, two questions. First, did you have a script going into it, or did you have these pieces that you knew you would assemble? Because they seem to have even though they're individual ones, there seems to be some kind of development, and I don't know if you anticipated that before. That's the first question. And then the second would be, as you were finishing it, what was your ambition or hope for its overall effect? Like, what would be the ideal response an audience member might have to it?
Yeah. For the first, I didn't have a script going into it. My producer, Rachel, I went and interviewed with her all of her dancers who were, she put out this open call to them saying, I have this friend who wants to film your habits, who's interested, which already narrowed down the group quite a bit. And for the ones who were interested, I went to their homes with Rachel and asked them to talk me through their days. And the moments in their days where they were conscious of repetitive movement, the moments where they experienced physical pleasure, pain, when did they feel they were dancing, if at all, and then asked them to show me the moments that I was most interested in, and left each person's home with a sense of what they were most invested in physically and what I was most attracted to. And then often had kind of backup options of what other movements we would look at, and knew that it was going to be a full day. And so then it was a matter of piecing the days together. And so before we started shooting, we had like a rough timeline of who was moving at what time of day, but definitely never a script. At one point, I think there was a piece of paper that said like 6 a.m., 10 a.m., and names and movements, but that's about as formal as it got. And then for the reactions, I think I got the ideal reaction. Exactly a year ago, we did a work in progress screening at a symposium on intergenerational art. And there was an elderly woman in the audience who had been experiencing chronic pain and felt that her daily routine and the slowness of her daily routine was this terrible thing. She hated having become a slow body. And she said that watching the film made her review her slowness as dance, and that she felt she was more beautiful because of that. And that was like the ideal thing anyone could feel from that for me.
Yeah. Lovely. Okay, so I'm gonna parse them. We'll talk about crowds. I have a couple of questions about the crowd project too. But does anybody have any other questions or thoughts or anything they want to ask Sarah about the home exercise project?
How long did it take to make?
I guess from the idea and looking for funding until screening, it was about 1.5 years. We had a really tiny crew and small budget, and one of the great things about having that tiny crew is we got to spend a full day with each person, which for a normal film schedule is unheard of, to get 5 minutes out of one day of shooting. And so we really made the schedule around the individuals we were working with, where we would show up, we would have a long leisurely breakfast, shoot for 5 minutes, hang out, shoot again it was very much about, we adapted to their home and were very much their guests in their home. So that changed the schedule a lot. But yeah, it was about 7 days of shooting, 2-3 months of editing and post. Not because it took that long, but because myself and my collaborators all had other jobs while doing it. And then it's playing different festivals right now.
To what extent do you see your own habits as choreography? Are you always thinking about your movements as choreography?
That's a good question. I think in general, yes. I don't think as I'm doing all my habits of the day, I'm going, this is dance, this is dance, this is dance. But yes, I would say so. I think the more pleasurable they are, the more willing I am to admit that, and the more the habits that I like least, I think I probably would say, no, this is not a part of my choreography, but that shows even how much more it is ingrained. So yes. Do you?
Okay, so would you consider the movie as okay, let's put it this way. Nowadays, a piece of music is not just the score as it used to be, but it's the recording. Because there are so many elements interacting with the final layout of the written score, then the recording is that we may say that's a final score. So would you consider the movie as the final stage of the choreography, or just a moment during which you froze your work and then your choreography is still open?
For home exercises or for both?
No, I mean, now, what you have, your opus, if the concept of opus attains to it, do you think that your movie is the opus, or the choreography has just been frozen for that little while and then it's still open for...
For me, it depends on the project. For home exercises...
home exercises,
yeah,
sorry.
for home exercises, that choreography doesn't exist outside of the film. I'm really interested in choreography that's created by the camera, that there are certain gestures and movements that would be unrecognizable were they not framed in a certain way. And so for me, the choreography of this film is just in the film. Surely bits of it are familiar to their lives, and it's taken from their lives, but the way in which we staged it and reenacted it only works on camera.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that case, it's just the film.
Okay, thank you. Because it reminded me at a certain point, it was 2004, in Boston there was a 48 hours festival of piano contemporary music, and one of the performers, sort of aging Austrian piano player, concert piano player, mocked a piece of romantic music. And you could tell by the way it was moving that it was a romantic music piece. And then we all start guessing, okay, that's Brahms, no, it's Schubert. And so at the end, he said, okay, yeah, it's Schubert. I was thinking of Schubert, but he never touched the keys.
That's fantastic.
So that's what came to my mind while I was watching your work.
Thank you.
The other question I had for you, following up on his question, is when you were, you had a loose script in terms of times of day and which character, but did you have a storyboard?
Of how we're going to shoot it?
Yes.
Absolutely. Both creatively and logistically it was necessary. Logistically, we knew that to do these movements, even though they're relatively minute movements, over and over again would be too much to ask of a lot of these individuals. And so we had to very specifically time, okay, if we know that this person can do this movement 3 times before they take their Parkinson's medication at this hour, then we can get this shot in the morning and this shot in the afternoon. And so it was all, my DP and I, after doing the interview process, scouted in a very detailed way where we knew exactly how we were going to shoot beforehand. I'm a terrible drawer, so my storyboards are very abstracted, but there was a storyboard, yes.
So you knew you had a sense of what combination of close-ups versus wide shots.
Yeah, absolutely. The only one that was improvised was the one in the nursing home with the woman who's sort of doing her happy dance to the Calypso song, because she has fairly advanced Alzheimer's and dementia, and She would forget that we were shooting this film, and so we had to set it up more where it was just a pleasurable afternoon for her, where she could dance and hang out, and played music that she loved. And so that was much more, the DP I work with has more of a documentary background, and so that was more of us responding to her than having it be this very pre-planned, more narrative filmmaking setup.
Interesting.
Between the two projects, I'm curious about how your pre-production process differed, one being sort of more spontaneous and documentarian, and the other one being more set in the choreography, and which process you find more challenging.
Well, it has a lot to do with the countries, because the first one, I mean, the choreographic process was really different. I would say I find them both challenging in different ways. One was very, very interpersonal. The other was also interpersonal, but I was working with professional dancers, and we were working for many months in a studio together, and it was just a very different environment where they're thinking of themselves as dancers and they're actively contributing to something that they recognize as choreography, versus a group of aging individuals who, many of them had taken dance classes before but don't see themselves as dancers, let alone see they're doing the dishes as dance. So I'd say communication-wise, it was just very distinct, both challenging in their own way. In terms of pre-production, I produced both of these projects, and shooting in people's living rooms who've given you permission and you just show up is very different than convincing the Italian government to let you take over their piazza for 3 days. So I'd say that was much more challenging. I started the process in October, and we shot on Easter weekend, and I would say being an independent individual without a production company who comes over to Italy and says, hey, I want to take over your piazza on Easter, you get a lot of so I'd say that was very challenging. There was a lot of red tape, and I don't necessarily want to, next time I do it, I'm gonna have an Italian producer, because that was, very challenging. You guys have a good bureaucracy over here.
And what is the hoped for effect of that project? It was just a little unfair to ask, because you're still in conversation with it, and the editing hasn't even begun. But as you imagined it, when you were first conceiving of it, what was your hoped for venue of distribution or exhibition, and what's the hoped for effect?
Yeah. I mean, right now, as I start editing, I'm imagining different scenarios of how it could be experienced. The dream version is to have it in an art space where you have each channel on its own screen, playing simultaneously, and each screen is set at a slight distance from the last, so that it creates this weaving pattern that you have in the most basic crowd control scenarios to transform a crowd into a queue, kind of like at an airport. And then instead of line stanchions, you would actually use the screens to create that pattern. And that each one would be more immersed than the last. So you're starting with the widest shot and ending with the Steadicam. And so that the viewer themselves has to create the cut by moving through it, and that no person will have the same experience of the crowd depending on when they get there, how quickly they move through it, how many people are there. That's the dream version. I'm also playing with single channel versions that could be seen in more of a festival setting. But ideally, we would really have this very immersive space.
Park Avenue Armory.
That, oh my God, that'd be a dream. That'd be a dream.
Yeah. Any other,
You mentioned something about LA. Did you grow up in LA?
I did. Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, did that affect your interest in crowds, and why you chose to make this? Do you think that any of your interest in crowds came from your upbringing in LA? You said there's a lot of traffic and a lot of car culture.
Maybe. I hadn't thought about that. I was born in LA, and I grew up between Santa Barbara and a little bit of Rome. I think the first inspiration actually was in Rome, because Rome has a lot of murmurating birds. If you've been to Fiumicino Airport, they love to hang out above Fiumicino Airport. Oh, really? Okay. So I'd say that had more, the birds had more of an impact than the humans did. Living in New York, I normally live in New York, not Bologna. I'd say that's, for me, a very crowded environment where I'm very aware of crowds. Los Angeles, everyone's in their vehicle bubbles, so I think about them less. But I think there could be a very interesting film of choreographed traffic that I don't quite have the budget for yet, but one day it could be fun to return and do that.
You talked briefly during your research, when you talked about your research, how the space or architecture was involved in the exercise that was performed. What decisions went into kind of choosing this space or this location, and the shots that were taken in the homes? So could you just talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So this piazza is slightly on the outskirts of Bologna in the Fiera district, and it was designed in the 1970s by a Japanese architect, and it has all of these towers that are meant to echo the medieval towers of Bologna. And so I looked at a lot of older piazzas. I specifically wanted to do this project in Italy because of the piazza and the role it plays in public space that I think is really unique in comparison to other countries. And piazzas here have everything from funeral processions to, there used to be executions, you have protest parties, so many different types of crowds form in piazzas. But I didn't want to limit our imagination of the types of crowds to something Italian. And so doing it in a piazza in Bologna that was much more historic would feel like this was just only an Italian crowd. And so what appealed to me, it's called Piazza Renzo and Beni, about this space is that it felt very generic in a way that was also very specific in its architecture, that it could be almost anywhere after mid-century. And so I loved that blurring of generic and local, that anyone in Bologna knows this piazza quite well. In terms of the camera movement, we really wanted to use the architecture of this space of imagining how a viewer might locomote through it. So the first shot, we shot from a crane because they wouldn't give us access to the towers, but I wanted it to be as if it's someone from a different tower looking in. The dolly shots were meant to wrap around the one passageway that encircles the piazza. Everything else is more inside of it, but it was definitely, the shot list came out of this space. And also, I think the way in which it's surrounded was really interesting to me, in that this could, both had access to the piazza if you wanted to join it, but also from any point you could feel like you were just surveying them. So that was the decision here. In terms of home exercises, there was never a question of transplanting their movement and putting it into somebody else's home, but we very deliberately chose which parts of the home we shot in, where they would actually do those movements. But I'd say the most deliberate choice was in the objects that remained. One of the hardest parts was convincing people not to clean their homes. Everybody before I came would try to pick up all of their stuff, and I would have to stop them and ask them to put it back exactly where it was. And same thing with their outfits. You know, instead of asking them, what would you wear on camera, it was, what were you wearing yesterday? And so we very much wanted to see the objects and surfaces that they would move with. So I'd say it was more architecture of things than actually choosing a new set or location.
Okay, so I grew up dancing and wanting to be a filmmaker, so I'm really curious to know how you came to combine those two things, and what your kind of first early ventures were into that, and how that combination has developed and crystallized over your career so far.
Yeah, I'd say I'm still in the early ventures of it. I guess I grew up dancing, but never wanted to be a performer. I always loved choreographing. And as a kid, I was really into photography and slowly those still images became more animate, and I started doing, first it was diptychs, and then triptychs, and then panoramas, and then stop motion, and it became very obvious that I was moving towards something that was going to be moving. And what I love watching is moving bodies, and so that intersection came pretty naturally. And I started making dance films as an undergraduate, and then kept doing that. And I think simultaneously I was studying screenwriting and realized that screenwriting for me was this process of annotating movement. And dance has such a weird relationship to annotation. And I found this liberation in screenwriting where you could write movement, and there was nothing fraught about writing movement. And so I think that contributed to this intersection for me as well. In terms of a career path, I'd say practically speaking, it's just all been having an idea and doing it. There isn't really an infrastructure that supports, at least in the US, I'll say there's no infrastructure that supports experimental dance filmmakers. There are a few grants, not very many. And I think one of the things I've really sought out, both in work experience and research, is looking at narrative filmmakers who are very conscientious of the moving body. And I've been lucky to assist filmmakers who've done that. So one of my first jobs was working for Steve McQueen, who doesn't make dance films, but I think his films are very attentive to embodied experiences. I love Kelly Reichardt's films, and I was lucky to do research for her, and her films have a lot to do with routine and habits as well. So I'd say for me, a lot of my first jobs were working for filmmakers who aren't choreographers, but who I think are making films that do contain a lot of kind of mundane choreography. But yeah, there's no kind of clear first step for dance filmmaking.
I think that's it. But I wanted to say one thing, just, if I can proselytize to all of you, but it's like, let Sarah be your example, because I think some of you, those are still at NYU in school, and what's wonderful is that so many of you that are sitting here are merging or converging, more than merging, converging different elements, and I really want to encourage you, that's all. That it doesn't, and sometimes to do that, when you've got 4 balls in the air, you have 4 things or 3 things that are really driving you, it's more difficult to find a direct path. That path might be a little circuitous, but the yield is really terrific. I mean, New Directors, New Films is a festival in New York which celebrates the first or second film of a number of directors. It's primarily a feature film festival, and takes only a very small handful of short films, of which Home Exercise was one. So it's really quite an accomplishment for any young filmmaker. I teach in the graduate division at NYU, and all of our students send all of their films there, and it's a very coveted, honor to have your movie there. And I was really pleased to see this movie screened at that festival. Anyway, thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for coming. It's been such a wonderful conversation with you.